The next talk is Marina, Simakov, and Yaron, Zinar, finding a needle in an encrypted haystack, leveraging cryptographic abilities to detect the most prevalent attacks on Active Directory. Guys?
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our talk. I'm Marina Simakov, and today I'm here with Yaron Zinar. We're both security researchers from Preempt, and today we want to talk to you about some of the vulnerabilities that we were able to discover this year. We have a lot of information for you today. Let's see the agenda. We'll begin with a short introduction to Active Directory and some of the common attacks. We'll focus a lot on the NTLM protocol, its design weaknesses, the NTLM Relay attack, and some of the offered mitigations that we have against this attack technique. Then we'll move on to discuss some vulnerabilities. We'll see some of the known ones and some of the new ones that we discovered this year, allowing us to bypass all present mitigations against NTLM Relay. Last but not least, we'll talk to you about detections, and we're quite excited to present the first deterministic NTLM Relay detection today. And we'll finish with some takeaways. Okay, so I guess most of you are probably familiar with the Active Directory, but I'll give just a brief introduction just in case. So Active Directory is the main secret storage of the domain. It stores the password hashes of all the accounts, and it is in charge of authenticating accounts against domain resources. This can be done using 3 different protocols, LDAP, NTLM, or Kerberos, and today we'll be focusing on the NTLM protocol and specifically on the NTLM Relay attack technique. So you might be scratching your heads thinking, is NTLM even still relevant? Well, actually, the answer is yes. Even though it's a technology from the Stone Ages, still many environments are using it. So even though we've had Kerberos for quite a while, we still haven't seen a single environment which disables NTLM completely. So this is quite relevant to most organizations today. Let's see a short overview of how the NTLM protocol works. Let's say we have a client that wants to connect to some domain server. Let's see the authentication flow. So the client would send an NTLM negotiate message to the server, and the server would respond with an NTLM challenge. Now the client would need to encrypt that challenge using the password hash of the user's account and respond in the NTLM authenticate message. Now, since the target server is not aware of the password hash of the user, it is not able to verify that the challenge was encrypted using the correct password hash, so it would send a netlogon message to the domain controller, which has the ability to verify whether the challenge was encrypted correctly, and respond with an approve or reject message accordingly. One of the problems with this protocol is that the authentication is not bound to the target server. So if this target server gets compromised, attackers can simply relay the authentication and use it to attack another server in the domain. This is exactly what happens in the NTLM Relay attack, and let's see this flow. So we have a client connecting using NTLM to a compromised server. So this can be by attackers compromising a server that usually accounts connect to, or by sending a phishing email to a lot of users, and some user clicks on the link and an NTLM authentication begins. Now attackers choose a target in the domain which they want to attack and relay that NTLM negotiate message to the target. They receive the challenge and relay it back to the client. Now the client will encrypt the challenge using the password hash of the user and send it back to the compromised server, and all the attackers need to do now is simply relay it back to the attack target. So when the target would verify whether the challenge was indeed encrypted correctly, since the client was the one that encrypted the challenge, the domain controller would approve the request, and the attackers now have an authenticated session using the user's permissions on the attacked server. So notice that at any stage, the attackers did not need to know the password of the user. All they did is relay messages back and forth between the client and the attack target. So if that user is a local admin on the target machine, attackers can now run code on the target, they can dump files, and entirely compromise that computer. This is a pretty serious attack vector. This is why we have a few mitigations against this attack technique. The most critical mitigations are session signing. We have SMB and LDAP signing, and we have EPA and channel binding. Those are the ones that we'll be focusing on today, and we'll show you how we were able to bypass both of them. Let's begin with session signing. What the session signing requirement means is that after the NTLM authentication is completed, all the communication between the client and the server needs to be signed. And the session signing key is derived from the authenticating user's password hash. So the client knows this password hash, so it simply computes it independently. Now the target doesn't store the password hashes of the account, so it would simply get the session signing key from the domain controller as a response to the net logon request. And if you have an attacker in the middle with relay capabilities, that attackers would they would not have a way to retrieve the session signing key, they would not be able to sign any additional packets, and the attack would fail. Okay, so let's see an illustration of this one. So the client would send an NTLM negotiate message to the compromised server. The server would relay that to the attack target. Again, we relay the challenge and the response. And now when the attack target sends the not logon message to the domain controller to verify whether the user entered the correct password, the domain controller would also respond with the session signing key. And the client would calculate the session key by himself. Now, the relay at the middle simply has no way to retrieve the session key. It cannot send any additional packets to the attack target, and the attack would fail. This is a very critical mitigation against NTLM Relay, and unfortunately, not enough servers enforce signing by default. The second mitigation that we want to discuss with you is EPA, Enhanced Protection for Authentication. Here, the goal is to protect NTLM authentications from being relayed to a TLS session. And we want to bind the NTLM authentication to the TLS session over which the packets are transferred. And the implementation of this is by adding an additional field to the final NTLM authenticate message called channel bindings. Now, this field contains a hash of the target server's certificate. And also it is signed using the user's password hash, so it cannot be modified by attackers. And if we have an attacker with relay capabilities in the middle, it would be necessarily using a different certificate than the attack target. So the value provided by the client in the channel bindings field would be based on the certificate of the compromised server. So if attackers try to relay this message to any other server which enforces EPA, this field would simply be not valid and the attack would fail. Okay, let's see an illustration again just to make things a bit more clear. So we have a client initiating a TLS session against the compromised server and sending an NTLM negotiate message. Now attackers target some server in the domain which enforces EPA, establish a different TLS session, and relay that NTLM negotiate message. We relay the challenge in the same way, and now the last NTLM authenticate message also contains this channel bindings field, which includes the hash of the target certificate of that compromised server. Now, attackers cannot modify this field. As we've said, the user signs it using the password hash of the user. And if they try to relay that message to the attack target, it will look into the channel binding field and see that the value is not based on its own certificate, and the attack would fail. So we'll not even need to verify the credentials against the domain controller. And so those were the two most critical mitigations that we have today against NTLM Relay. And now Yaron will speak about some of the vulnerabilities and show you how we're able to bypass both those mitigations.
Thanks, Marina. So over the years, attackers have found many vulnerabilities, allowing attackers to exploit the vulnerabilities and launch NTLM Relay attacks. Let's review the most recent one. So the first vulnerability I want to talk about is LDAP-S Relay. This vulnerability was discovered by our team back in 2017, and we have found that LDAP servers was somewhat vulnerable to NTLM Relay attacks. So as Marina mentioned, NTLM is not inherently protected from NTLM Relay. If you want to protect an NTLM session, you'll need to either enable server signing or to enable EPA. There is a special GPO enabling LDAP server signing on the domain controllers, and if that GPO is enabled, the DC would accept only requests that are LDAP requests that are signed with GSS API, but it would also request any LDAP request over a TLS channel. This means that if we relay credentials to an LDAP-S session, we'll be able to completely pawn that session. So we've disclosed this issue to Microsoft back in 2017, and they've fixed it by enabling EPA on LDAP-S. It is important to note that LDAP is still vulnerable by default, since the GPO for enabling LDAP server signing is not enabled by default, and EPA is also not enabled by default. The second vulnerability I want to talk about was disclosed in 2015 by Alberto Solino from Core Security, and that was a generic bypass of all NTLM session requirements. So let's review how the attack worked. The initial part was just like any NTLM relay, and since the attack target enforces server signing, when it sends the NTLM message, it receives a session key. Now, if we don't have a session key, we can't use the session and sign any SMB requests, but as it turned out, before this was fixed, any machine in the network, if it knew the challenge and the challenge response, could spoof its own netlogon message with these fields and receive its own session key. Once the attacker has a session key, he can send requests over the SMB channel and completely pawn that machine. So now it gets a bit trickier. I want to discuss how Microsoft fixed that issue. So in order to understand, we'll need to dive a bit deeper into the NTLM protocol. The second message, the NTLM challenge, has a target info field. The target info field has special constructs named AV pairs. These fields should identify the target. The field I'm going to focus on is the net BIOS computer name. The net BIOS computer name identifies the net BIOS of the target server machine. In this case, it's test-01. The NTLM client, when it receives this target info AV pairs, would echo all the fields that it received in the echo pairs. So we see that the client echoed the net BIOS computer name, test-01, but the important part is that all AV pairs in the NTLM authenticate message are signed with the anti-proof STR, where the secret key is the user's anti-hash. So an attacker with no knowledge of the user's anti-hash cannot modify or tamper with this message. So what Microsoft essentially did was to compare the net BIOS computer name in the authenticate message with the machine that originated the netlogon. So let's review again. The attack target, which is the legitimate target, sends a netlogon message and he receives a session key. Now the server would initiate a similar spoofed netlogon session. The NTLM authenticate and the netlogon would contain the net BIOS computer name, which identifies the attack target, and the netlogon originator is the compromised server. The DC can see the discrepancy and just reject the request. Since the request is rejected, we didn't receive any session key, and we were unable to sign the SMB session. Now I want to move on to the new vulnerabilities we have found. So we're going to present 3 vulnerabilities for you today. The first, your session key is my session key, is another generic bypass of NTLM server signing. The second, drop the mic, is a vulnerability bypassing another NTLM security mechanism, the message integrity code, which we will discuss later. And the fourth vulnerability, EPA bypass, bypassing EPA and channel binding. That's correct. During our research, we were able to bypass all major NTLM mitigations. Let's talk about the first vulnerability. Your session key is my session key. So if we look back at the fix Microsoft did in 2015, comparing the netlogon originator to the net BIOS computer name in the authenticate message, we thought to ourselves, what would happen if we'll simply remove the net BIOS computer name? So if we look at the NTLM challenge message, the net BIOS computer name is an AV pair, and since we're the relayer and we have control of the entire communication, we can create a modified NTLM challenge message with no net BIOS computer name. What happens is that the NTLM client receives this malformed request, and apparently it just accepts the request with no net BIOS computer name, creating an NTLM authenticate message that obviously does not have the net computer name. The NTLM server would also accept the NTLM authenticate with no net BIOS computer name and would generate a netlogon message with no net BIOS computer name. The third surprising thing is that the DC would receive a netlogon message with no net BIOS computer name, With no NetBIOS computer name is unable to perform the validation that the NetLogon is spoofed or not, and would simply approve the request. So there is one last obstacle we need to overcome, and that's the message integrity code. The message integrity code is a cryptographic signature signing all three NTLM messages in the same session: the NTLM negotiate, NTLM challenge, and NTLM authenticate. The cryptographic key for the MIC is the NTLM session signing key, and probably you already understand the solution. We can spoof a NetLogon message, retrieve the NTLM session key, and simply recalculate the MIC. Let's look at the attack flow. I know it was a bit complex, so we'll run over it again. The compromised server receives an NTLM challenge message and tampers with this message, removing the NetBIOS computer name. The NTLM client accepts this message and sends an NTLM authenticate message that does not contain a NetBIOS computer name. We are creating a spoofed NetLogon message, and the DC cannot validate whether we are the correct target or not, and simply returns a session key. Now that we have a session key, we are recalculating the MIC and sending a message with the MIC that the attack target expects. Obviously, the attack target would create a very similar NetLogon message and receive the same session key that we have. Now that we have a session key and an NTLM authenticated session, we can perform any SMB command that we like. Now I want to stress the importance of this issue. NTLM server signing is the only mitigation protecting domain controllers from the authentication. So if we're able to capture an NTLM session from a domain admin, there's no mitigation. We could relay this NTLM session to a domain controller, dumping hashes, running code on that domain controller, completely compromising that machine. So now I want to present a demo. Okay, so I'm using IMPacket, which is an open source tool for performing NTLM relay attacks, and the first attack is not using our vulnerability. As you can see, no session signing key was able to be retrieved, and the domain controller rejected our SMB session since it is not signed. Now let's look at the network traffic. We can see that the NTLM authenticate message contains a NetBIOS computer name. So we are unable to spoof a NetLogon request, and the SMB session is not signed. You can see that the signature field is zeros, and that's why the server rejected our request. Now let's try running the same attack with our modified exploit. Okay, so you see we are running this command with two additional fields. One is the the computer account's hash, and the second is the remove target, removing the NetBIOS name from the NTLM challenge. Now we're going to the other machine where a privileged account is performing a browsing session, and you can see that we were able to retrieve a session signing key. Here is the session signing key, and we were able to create an SMB session to the domain controller, dumping some hashes from the domain controller. We could have run any other command and compromised the domain. Now let's look again at the network traffic. So you can see the original NetLogon NTLM message that contained the NetBIOS computer name. You can see on the HTTP channel, we've modified the NTLM challenge, removing the NetBIOS computer name. And you can see that the browser sent us back an NTLM message with no NetBIOS computer name. So we relayed that message. You can't see the NetLogon since it's encrypted, but we've retrieved the session key. And now you can see that the SMB session is signed. So just to summarize, we have presented another attack allowing any attacker in the network to retrieve NTLM session keys and make any NTLM relay attack work. Now I want to discuss the fix. So we have disclosed this issue to Microsoft a while back, and Microsoft acknowledged the issue and sent a fix in their June patch release. The fix Microsoft did was for NTLM servers, target servers, to authenticate whether the NTLM authenticate message contains a NetBIOS computer name. And if no NetBIOS computer name is present, then they'll simply reject that request. There are a few caveats with the fix that we want to talk about. The first, probably the most interesting, is that AV pairs are a feature of NTLM v2. This means that if an attacker gets his hands on an NTLM v1 session, there's no mitigation for him to stop relaying that session. So if you're using NTLM v1, you'll probably get relayed. The second is that the fix is applied on NTLM servers and not domain controllers. This means that any older Windows version, like Windows XP, is still vulnerable, and other Windows OS that receives NTLM authentications are also vulnerable to this issue. The third, probably a small tidbit, is that patching, as always, is not enough. In order for patch to work, you'll need to restart your machine. And since the patch is not applied centrally on the DC, disapproving rogue netlogon messages, any unrestarted machine in your network is still vulnerable to this attack. With that, I'm going to pass the stage back to Marina to present the 2 additional vulnerabilities we have found.
Okay, thank you, Yaron. I hope you're concentrated enough to see 2 more vulnerabilities that we found. The first is drop the MIC, the message integrity code. The message integrity code is an HMAC MD5 using the session key on the 3 NTLM messages. And the goal of this message integrity code is to verify that attackers did not tamper with any of the NTLM messages. Let's see an example of why we might need this MIC field. Let's say we have a client connecting to a compromised server using NTLM. And let's say that it wants to establish a signed communication. So this is done by setting the negotiate sign flag that you can see up on the screen in the NTLM negotiate message. Now, if attackers try to relay this message as is to another server that supports signing, all they would get is a signed session. Now, let's assume that all the servers are patched and attackers have no way to retrieve the signing key. So they would not be able to sign any communication to the attack server and the attack would fail. However, what they might try to do is unset this signing flag in order to create an unsigned session against the target. However, even changing a single bit in one of those 3 NTLM messages would make the message integrity code no longer valid and the attack would fail. So that would not be possible. SMB clients turn on the signing negotiate flag by default and also they use a MIC. This is why it was considered very hard or even impossible to perform NTLM relay from SMB to any other protocol, simply because the attackers would need to sign the session and they would not be able to retrieve the signing key. This is in contrast to other protocols such as HTTP, which do not set this flag, so it's much easier to perform NTLM relay from HTTP to SMB or LDAP to domain controllers. However, let's say our attackers are persistent and they want to perform NTLM relay to an NTLM authentication over SMB. How can they remove the signing requirement? We saw that in order to modify the message integrity code, attackers need to have knowledge of the signing key, but we assume that they cannot retrieve it in any way. What they can do is simply remove the MIC from the message. So we just needed to remove the MIC and the version and also modify some of the negotiation flags, but it was simple as that. We just removed the MIC from the message in order to bypass its protection. And it's a funny story of how we discovered this vulnerability. We were working on a completely unrelated vulnerability, and this MIC was interfering with what we were trying to do. So we removed the MIC and moved on to discover that vulnerability. After finishing, we had to look back and think, wait, did we just find something else? Do we need to disclose that one as well? And it turns out that we did. So by removing the MIC, it allows attackers to tamper with any stage of the NTLM authentication. So this is pretty serious. As you can see, an original NTLM authenticate message that has a version and message integrity code, and our modified message simply missing those 2 fields. Okay, so let's see an overview of this attack. A client would connect to a compromised server by sending an NTLM negotiate message stating that he supports signing. Now, attackers cannot relay this message because they would not be able to retrieve the signing key. What they can do is unset this signing flag and relay the message to another attack target, receive the challenge, and now if the attack target does not enforce signing, they would respond with the challenge and state that no signing was negotiated. Now attackers need to relay this back to the client, and usually clients don't enforce session signing, so the client would accept this message and reply with an NTLM authenticate message, which includes a message integrity code. Now notice this message integrity code is signing the 3 NTLM messages between the client and the compromised server. So the first NTLM negotiate message states that signing is supported. Since attackers did not relay this message, they cannot use this message integrity code. So they simply remove it from the message. All that is left is to verify the credentials. We had the original client encrypt the challenge, so we're good in that way. And now attackers have established an unsigned session against the attack target of their choice, which does not enforce signing. This is why enforcing signing on as many machines in your domain is very important. Let's discuss what enabled this vulnerability to even happen. As it turns out, there is an AV pair called flags in the last NTLM authenticate message. And if the second bit of this flag field is turned on, it means that the client states that it is providing a MIC in the challenge. Sorry, in the authenticate message. So the client is stating, I am providing a MIC in the message, and also adds a MIC. However, the server, upon receiving this request, even if the flag states that the client is providing a MIC, doesn't actually verify that a MIC is present. So it doesn't matter what that field states. Okay, so this is what enabled us to simply remove the MIC from the NTLM authenticate message. Let's talk about the fix. Now that we know what the flags does, it's pretty easy to understand how Microsoft fixed the issue. So all they needed to do is for a server, when receiving an NTLM authenticate message that states in the flag that a MIC is present, just verify that a MIC is present. Still some issues with this because some clients don't add a message integrity code by default, such as Firefox on Linux or Mac OS machines. So those clients would still be vulnerable to NTLM session tampering, simply because they don't provide a MIC, and attackers can still remove the negotiate signing flag. And the more serious issue is that we were already able to bypass this fix as well, and we have a vulnerability we like to call drop the MIC 2. However, Microsoft hasn't patched this one yet, so we'll not be discussing it today, but we'll have a blog in a few days discussing this issue, so stay tuned if you want to hear more about this one. All right, last vulnerability that we have for you today is the EPA bypass. As I've mentioned in the beginning, the goal of the EPA security feature is to bind the NTLM authentication to the TLS session over which the authentication happens. Some of the servers that can be protected by EPA include ADFS, OWA, LDAP-S, or other HTTP servers which support Windows integrated authentication. So if attackers are able to relay credentials to ADFS servers, they might be able to take over your cloud resources as well. If they're able to relay to OWA, they can read a user's emails or send emails on his behalf. And if they're able to relay to LDAP-S on domain controllers, if that relayed user has enough privileges, they can perform malicious modifications to Active Directory objects. Unfortunately, by default, EPA is not enabled on any of those servers. So all those servers by default are vulnerable to the simplest NTLM relay attack. So attackers would not even need to work hard to bypass the EPA feature. However, let's assume you have a very secure environment and you've enabled EPA on all of those servers. Let's see how we'd be able to bypass that as well. I've discussed that the implementation of EPA is by adding a channel bindings field to the last NTLM authenticate message. And this field is based on the certificate of the target server and also signed by the anti-proof STR, so it cannot be modified. And again, since attackers would be using a different certificate, they would not be able to relay this message to an attack target which enforces EPA. So attackers have no way to modify the NTLM authenticate message to include the channel bindings field that they would like to be there. What can they do? Let's look at the NTLM challenge message. We know that when a client receives an NTLM challenge, it echoes the fields that it receives in the AV pairs into the NTLM authenticate message. So what we tried doing is calculating the channel binding field in advance. We can do this because it is based on public attributes of the certificate, so we can just calculate it in advance and inject it into the NTLM challenge. So we're sending a client an NTLM challenge with the channel bindings that contains the value that we want for our target to accept our message. So let's see what the client will do. Turns out that the client would add our crafted field into the NTLM authenticate message and sign it. However, it would also add an additional channel bindings field, which would be set to all zeros. So we have the field that we want in the message, but we have an additional one. The only question left is what will the target server, the one that enforces EPA, will do when receiving such a message. So he has two channel bindings, what will the server do? Turns out that it will take the first field, the one we injected in advance to fit what it expects, and simply accept our authentication. Last obstacle that we might have, we just modify the NTLM challenge message. The MIC is no longer valid, but we know how to overcome this one already. We simply drop the MIC from the NTLM authenticate message. Okay, so let's see a detailed flow because it contained many different things that we had to do. So we have a client connecting using NTLM to a compromised server. Now attackers are establishing a TLS session against an attack target which enforces EPA and relaying this NTLM negotiate message to the attack target. We're receiving a challenge and also calculating the channel binding field we need to inject in order to bypass EPA on that server and simply inject it into the NTLM challenge that we relay back to the client. The client encrypts the challenge, adds a rogue channel binding into the message, and also add a message integrity code. We've already discussed that we cannot relay this message integrity code back to the attack target because we just modified the challenge. So we just remove the message integrity code from the message. And since the message includes the channel bindings field that we calculated in advance to fit what the server expects, we'd be able to bypass EPA. And of course, since the challenge was computed using the correct password hash, the domain controller would approve our request. And now we can do anything we want on that attack target, which can be, again, an ADFS, OA, or even a domain controller. All right, let's see a demo of this one as well. So what we'll see here is we'll have an HTTP server, an HTTP relay server, which a client would connect to, and we'll try to relay the NTLM authentication over LDAP-S to a domain controller, which enforces LDAP-S channel binding. So we'll see in the first scenario where we're not using our vulnerability, we will fail. And then when we implement our vulnerability, the domain controller would allow us to do what we want. So what we're trying to do is to take a user called test user and add it to the enterprise admins group. As you can see, I hope you can see, if not, we'll upload this later. The test user is not an administrative account. We're running our HTTP relay server and trying to connect using a client to our rogue HTTP relay server. Now you can see that the authentication failed. We were not able to authenticate to the domain controller via LDAP-S. And you can see that there is no channel binding in the challenge. And then in the authenticate message, we can see that we have a channel binding, but it is set to all zeros. So this is the one that we relay back to the domain controller. And the domain controller does not accept our message. This is not the channel binding field that it is expecting. All right, now we'll try to run it again, but this time we'll add two new parameters. First of all, we'll be removing the MIC, and second, we'll be injecting our channel binding into the challenge message. Okay, so let's run this one again and connect using the client to our rogue HTTP server and see what happens this time. So in the console, we can see that the authentication was successful and that we were able to add our test user to the enterprise admins group. Let's look at what happened in the traffic. So the original challenge that we got from the domain controller did not have a channel binding. However, the one we're sending back to the client does contain the channel binding that we computed in advance. Okay, so the client signs our rogue channel binding, you can see it here, and adds an additional one which is set to all zeros. We relay this message back to the domain controller. You can see again that we have our channel binding and an additional one set to all zeros. And also there is no MIC in the message, while the original message did include a MIC. So we were able to bypass LDAP channel binding on that server by injecting our malicious channel binding into the challenge message. You can see now that the test user is an enterprise admin, and attackers can do anything they want and completely compromise that domain. Okay, so thank you. So that was our channel binding bypass, and it's also the last vulnerability that we'll see. Let's discuss the fix for a second. The fix is based on detecting a signature of this attack. So if a server receives an authenticate message that has two channel bindings, it would simply deny the request. Still some problems with this fix because some clients don't support EPA and don't add a MIC. Those are the same ones that I've discussed previously. So attackers would still be able to inject a channel binding to those clients, and since those don't support EPA, they would not add an additional one, and attackers would be able to target those to relay authentication attempts to domain controllers, for example. Okay, so we've seen many vulnerabilities. We've just seen how we're able to bypass all the most critical mitigations against NTLM Relay. Now let's see some of the detection. Let's see some of the detections that we have in order to detect the attack techniques that I've just presented.
Thanks, Marina. So by now, I think you've all understood that NTLM is risky. NTLM is risky not only due to the vulnerabilities we have discovered, but also due to bad configurations and insecure default values. So we believe a deterministic algorithm to detect NTLM relay is critically needed. Before I'll talk about the NTLM relay detection, I want to take a bird's eye view and discuss Active Directory attack detection. Most research on detecting Active Directory infrastructure attacks focuses on two paradigms. The first, analyzing network traffic, and the second, analyzing logs. If you consider analyzing network traffic, there's not a lot of research on analyzing encrypted traffic. If we look at some typical examples, we can see that, for instance, golden and silver tickets, most common detection methods include analyzing the encryption algorithm, ticket lifetime, and other creation attributes. We argue that if you'll decrypt the Kerberos tickets and validate that the fields are not malicious, you'll be able to create a better detection for golden tickets and silver tickets. The second, attack tools performing reconnaissance, such as Bloodhound doing SAMR or LDAP reconnaissance, are mostly caught by analyzing the LDAP queries that they do. While analyzing logs such as ETW can create detections, if we want to enforce traffic in real time, we have to have network-based detections. While these tools often are encrypted, making network-based detection harder, if we'll decrypt the traffic, we'll be able to have a much better detection. The third is NTLM Relay. Up till this point, no NTLM Relay detection had existed, except from analyzing anomalous NTLM activity. So what we want to do is to present the first NTLM Relay detection. In order to do that, I'm going to do another deep dive into the NTLM authenticate message. So as you recall, the NTLM authenticate message has AV pairs. Some of them are echoed from the target info. Others are created by the NTLM client, identifying the server that it wanted to connect to. One of these fields that I'm going to focus about is the target name. The target name is very similar to SPN in Kerberos, and in this example, it's CIFS/10.1.1.1, meaning the NTLM client originally connected to an SMB server with that relevant IP. As with any other AV pair, this AV pair is part of the anti-proof STR, and no attacker can modify or tamper with this field. So, as we know, once the NTLM server receives an NTLM authenticate message, it would forward this message, copying it entirely in the netlogon message, along with all the AV pairs. So how can we use this fact to detect the NTLM relay? What we can do is simply compare the NTLM relay to the netlogon originator to the target name provided in the message. If a relay had a code, the attack target would be identified as the netlogon originator, and the relayer, which is different, will be identified by the AV pair identifying the target name. So how such an detection device can work? The detection device would analyze all traffic incoming to the DC, looking for netlogon messages. After we'll decrypt these netlogon messages, we can find NTLM authenticate message and see if the NTLM server that originated the netlogon is the same machine that is identified in the target server SPN. So I know this is a bit complex, so let's review it again. So we begin with a regular NTLM relay attack. The client receiving the NTLM challenge would create an NTLM authenticate message, and this message would contain a target server AV pair. We cannot modify this target server AV pair as attackers, so we simply relay that NTLM authenticate message with the target server. The attack target would initiate a netlogon session, and since it wants to enforce server signing, my mistake. So the attack target would initiate a netlogon message. Now the netlogon message is originated by the attack target, and the DC knows that the attack target originated the netlogon message. But if we'll inspect the target server AV pair, we can detect that there is a discrepancy. The target name identifies the compromised server, and the netlogon originator is the attack target. If we see that this discrepancy exists, this must have been an NTLM relay attack, and we can block this message, completely blocking the attempt, regardless if server signing is enabled or disabled. So what are the requirements to do so? We'll need to monitor all DC traffic, and we'll need to keep track of all computer accounts hashes, since netlogon messages are encrypted. Once we decrypt the netlogon message, we can simply compare the SPN present in the netlogon message to the netlogon originator. This detects all NTLM relay attacks done with NTLM v2, except one small scenario, man in the middle. The reason we don't detect man in the middle is since with man in the middle, the compromised device directs the NTLM authenticate message to the same server the client originally wanted to connect to. We believe this scenario is less important for a couple of reasons. First, man in the middle attacks are harder to accomplish than NTLM relay attacks. Second, if session signing is not enabled, it can be done with Kerberos. And third, you can only attack a single target, which the client originally wanted to connect to. Decrypting netlogon traffic does not only help with generic NTLM relay detection. We can detect the two vulnerabilities we have found. We can detect the first vulnerability if we look at the netlogon message and see that the AV pairs does not contain a NetBIOS computer name. This means someone tried to exploit your session key is my session key vulnerability. The second vulnerability can also be detected. We can detect EPA bypass. If we see a netlogon message with an NTLM authenticate that contains two channel bindings AV pairs, we know someone tried to exploit the EPA bypass vulnerability. And third, probably the most critical, as I've mentioned, NTLM v1 is not protected at all. But if we can look at all netlogon messages, if we'll see two netlogon messages that contain the same challenge and challenge response, we know someone tried to pass the challenge and do a spoof netlogon session either with your session key is my session key or the previous 2015 vulnerability. Other than just detecting vulnerabilities, if we'll decrypt netlogon message, there's a real treasure for blue teams. We can look at the netlogon data, the decrypted netlogon data, and create reports about the security configuration in the network. For instance, if we see messages that don't contain the AV flags signaling the MIC presence, we know that there are computers in the network that send NTLM authenticate messages with no MIC. We can detect weak encryption methods like LM and NTLM v1. And probably the last, which is the most interesting in my opinion, we can detect NTLM authenticate message inside netlogons that don't have a channel bindings field. If we can see such messages, this means these web servers don't strictly enforce EPA and hence vulnerable to NTLM relay attacks. So what are the takeaways we think you should leave this session with? The first, obviously, you need to patch all your machines. The second, NTLM is risky, you need to reduce it, and while you don't finally eradicate that protocol, you'll need to enable server signing and EPA on all machines in the network. The third one I take away is that you should stop using NTLM v1. It was previously published that all NTLM v1 sessions can be cracked. We have now presented that all NTLM v1 sessions can be relayed. Seriously, just stop using NTLM v1. So the last part is that since I know that mitigating all NTLM vulnerabilities is a process, we believe that the NTLM detection algorithms we have just presented can go a long way in making networks more secure. Some credits are in due. First, Eyal Karni and Sagi Schoenfeld from the Preempt research team have also contributed to this research. Second, Alberto Solino for helping us integrate our attack code into IAM Packet, and for IAM Packet in general, which is an awesome tool that we use all the time. In fact, all the demos you've seen today were using IAM Packet. So my recommendation is that you'll stop using NTLM altogether. But if you can't resist, I hope the lessons you've learned today would help you not get relayed. Thank you.